Seems only appropriate given my channel name that there is an actual Jammidodger in the... I don't want to call it a set, this is not professional enough to be a set. I don't know, but this is a Jammidodger cushion that Shabba got me for Christmas. Hello, so shock horror. Oh my god. This video is just confirming what a lot of you watching and what I already knew, and that is that the LGB Alliance is definitely anti-trans. Hey Spuds, how's it going? It's Jamie and welcome back to another video. Thank you so much for clicking on this video. I hope you enjoy it. So to no surprise, but unfortunately, there are two updates about the LGB Alliance. Two recent things. I mean, there's more than two, but like there are two main things that I'm going to be talking about the LGB Alliance that does seem to kind of confirm some very strongly transphobic views among members and just as a collective group. So as a refresher, the LB. It just feels so wrong not to say T's that I can't do it. So to refresh your memories, the LGB Alliance is a group that is primarily formed, or it started off being primarily formed by ex-LGBT+ charity group members from Stonewall. Group members of the LGBT+ charity Stonewall who left Stonewall because they weren't happy that Stonewall including trans people, and they formed their own LGB Alliance thing that did not include trans people. That's basically the core of it. In their communication so far, they have been saying that they just want to progress LGB rights that they feel are now being overshadowed by trans rights. Strange, I know. I mean, that in of itself would not be transphobic and is not anti-trans, and before everybody starts saying, oh yeah, but there is a difference between the LGB and the T, and I think they should be separate. I'm not trying to argue that they should never be separate. We don't need to be joined at the hip. I still think we're stronger together, but it's okay if people want to do things separately sometimes. That separation is not what I'm saying is anti-trans. I wouldn't be making this video if they were legitimately just a pro-LGB group that just kind of left the trans alone and were like, no, we just want to go separate for a bit. However, if it wasn't already blindingly obvious from the previous video I made on this, I put a link in the description box, and based on their manifesto points that they were kind of like a smidge anti-trans, a couple things that have happened recently really confirm that. It's now very much slap you in the face with a fist kind of obvious that they just are not liking trans people. The first thing that made this active trans exclusion and anti-transness extra obvious was when the LGB Alliance had an amazing opportunity to pose some questions to prospective parliamentary candidates to try and progress LGB rights. In November 2019, I believe it was November 2019, the LGB Alliance were given the opportunity to go and ask some questions to prospective parliamentary candidates. You know, see what these parliamentary candidates were about, whether they're invested in minority rights. Sounds great, right? Sounds like a really cool opportunity, and in no way am I bitter that they were going there just to progress LGB rights. I always think people are stronger together, and it does make sense to me that LGB rights are fought alongside for trans rights, and the LGB and the T go together with the plus, you know, all little happy community family. But at the end of the day, I would really not care, and I would not be calling them out or wasting my breath making a video like this if their genuine intentions were to just go and progress cisgender LGB rights. I think there is still a lot of progression to be made, and if that's where they wanted to focus their energy, then go for it. But where I'm not okay with it, and where I am going to call them out on being anti-trans, is that they wasted this amazing political opportunity to progress LGB rights and just asked questions and made efforts to backtrack trans rights. Absolutely zero zilch, not even a peanut, because peanuts are small, not even a peanut of effort was put into actually progressing anybody's rights. Some of the questions the LGB Alliance decided to ask included, number one, and I'm going to read this so I get it right. Children are increasingly being taught that people can have many different gender identities. We believe this to be confusing and potentially harmful to children's future mental and physical health. Where do you stand on this doctrine? If you oppose it, what will you do to prevent this idea being taught to the nation's children? I mean, what do you think? Does that fall into a category of we're here to progress LGB rights, or we're here to shit on trans people? Question number two, do you agree that women-only spaces and services should be for the sole use of females, i.e. natal women, i.e. not trans women? That's what they're saying, because they think trans women are men. And number three, which is back on the topic of children and learning about LGB tea stuff. Will you ensure that the school's programme, No Outsiders in Our School, is revised to include information about sexual orientation, straight, lesbian, gay and bisexual, but to omit references to the doctrine of gender identity? Basically, will you continue to teach our children about LGB people, but not trans people because they're not real? And all 12 questions, I believe there were 12 questions, carried on in a similar fashion. I'm not going to read them all out because, quite frankly, they make me frustrated. Every single question contains something negative or negative connotations towards the trans community and about excluding trans people in various different places of life and society. I just want to know why. Why do people have to do that? Just... More recently, the LGB Alliance displayed a second act of trans-exclusionaryism. Is that a word? A more recent act of anti-transness, being against trans people. And this was their response to the proposed Scottish reform of the Gender Recognition Act. And it's what prompted me to make this video. The LGB Alliance wrote a letter to the Cabinet Secretary of the Scottish Parliament. This letter was in response to a publication of a Gender Recognition Reform Bill by the Scottish Government. There's been conversations about a Gender Recognition Act reform for many years now, and the short explanation of this bill that's come from the Scottish Government is that they just want to make the process that little bit easier for trans people to be legally recognised as their gender. So for someone like me, a trans guy to be legally recognised as male. It's a process I actually went through recently, and I can tell you it is expensive, it's lengthy, it's complicated, and it makes you feel vulnerable because you have to hand over a lot of very personal information to a panel of complete strangers who then sit around and decide if you're trans enough, and I guess in my case it would be if I'm male enough. It's the process that trans people in the UK go through to be legally recognised in all capacities as the gender they identify as, and this is for binary trans people, so for trans women to be legally recognised as women, and for trans men to be legally recognised as men, and also to legally change their sex on the birth certificate. So I'm now legally recognised in all capacities as a man, and my birth certificate says sex, male. And my gender recognition certificate also shows my gender as male. So the Scottish Government made a gender recognition reform bill to make this process easier, and I quite frankly love that idea because it is incredibly complicated, and with no surprise, this letter that the LGB Alliance wrote was very, very, very strongly against any kind of reform to the Gender Recognition Act. And they gave a selection of very interesting reasons as to why they believe that no reform should occur. The first is that they feel that any reform to the Gender Recognition Act would undermine LGB people, as they believe that the definitions lesbian, gay and bisexual are, and I quote, rooted in the scientific reality that there are two sexes, male and female. Let's just unpack this a little bit. So for getting everything wrong in that sentence, i.e. everything, they also apparently forgot that intersex people exist. Sex is not binary, and that is what science says. I've provided some useful links if you want to go read about it in the description box below. And this is not me trying to argue that intersex people fall into a category of like a third sex, but instead I'm trying to say that sex is not binary and it's not as black and white as just male and female. There are grey areas, and chromosomes do not always lead to the sex that you would expect or the genitals that you would expect. They go on to say that the bill will confuse the reality of two sexes with an invented spectrum of gender identities, calling it fashionable and not supported by any evidence. There is actually a lot of scientific support for the existence of trans people, that gender can be different to biological sex. It's this part alone that pretty much confirms that the LGB Alliance don't believe that trans people are real, and that actually their whole agenda is just to erase trans rights. And then we move on to the very, very tired, exhausting argument of trans women in women's spaces, and the fact that the LGB Alliance believe that trans women are men and will therefore be invading women's spaces. Firstly, it's impossible to invade a space that you belong in, and trans women very much belong in women's spaces. Somehow, they also completely ignore the fact that if their ideas were to become reality, and trans women were recognised as their birth sex and therefore forced to use male facilities and male-only places and then trans men would be forced to use women-only spaces, like I would be forced to use a female bathroom and changing room. And that would be very awkward. Thus proving their argument that it's not about protecting women from men, it's about being transphobic, primarily towards trans women, because fundamentally they just don't see trans people as their gender identity. They bang on about this point for several paragraphs, going on to say that reform in the bill will see thousands of grown men accessing girls' toilets and women's changing rooms. Some numbers and assumptions they've clearly plucked out of their arse explains why they're a pile of crap. The worry that by making trans people's lives easier will mean that more predatory men will access women-only spaces just does not make sense. If a man wants to go into the women's toilets to attack a woman, the least of their worries is going to be that they are a man in the women's toilets, and they're definitely not going to change their sex legally before doing this. Being worried about predatory men in women's spaces does not mean you get to attack trans women. The letter goes on with very similar, very repetitive points for a couple of paragraphs. It's very tedious reading, to be honest. But the short story is that LGB Alliance's main argument is that they are worried about trans women invading women-only spaces, and because they're transphobic, they call trans women men. And they feel that women-only spaces would be easier to be invaded by men if there was a reform in the Gender Recognition Act, because they think a lot of men would then get gender recognition certificates and go into the women's toilets. For a final time, let's unpack this. Say it with me. Trans women are women, and are therefore not men accessing women's spaces, and therefore have every right to go in to a women's toilet or a women's changing room. And also, a massive point that is being missed by the LGB Alliance is that transgender people are legally allowed to use the facilities and the single gender spaces of their gender identity without getting a gender recognition certificate, as that right is covered by the Equality Act, not the Gender Recognition Act. So a reform of the Gender Recognition Act will have no effect whatsoever on the ability of trans people being able to access toilets, changing rooms and other facilities of their gender identity. I've been using the men's toilets and changing rooms and other male-only facilities and whatnot for 8 years, and I've been legally allowed to do so, but I've only had my gender recognition certificate for a couple of months. Like, it doesn't make any difference. So really, arguing against any reform of the Gender Recognition Act in the way that LGB Alliance have is kind of like farting in a jam jar. Pointless and a little bit weird. At the end of the day, the LGB Alliance is basically an anti-trans hate group with the thinnest of veils, trying to pretend that they are simply pro-cisgender LGB rights. The rights of LGB cis people and trans people are not mutually exclusive. Just because trans rights are starting to progress, it does not mean that LGB rights are going backwards. And what the LGB Alliance really needs to realise is the reason why they're having to shout louder and louder is because trans rights are just progressing more and more, and ultimately they can't stop that. And also, ultimately, it does not have any negative effect on LGB rights. Trans women always face the brunt of transphobia in these situations, but the reality is that trans women are women, and they are women who have every right to access and use women-only spaces. Trans women are not just men who are pretending to be women to access women's toilets or changing rooms. If cis men do want to access women's toilets and spaces, they will do this anyway without pretending to be women. And they certainly wouldn't go to the unnecessary and costly lengths of obtaining a gender recognition certificate in order to do so. And even if there was 1 in a million cis men who did go to those lengths, it does not mean that you get to invalidate an entire group of people and take their rights away. So why am I talking about it? Why is this important? I'm gonna tell you. Of course I'm gonna tell you. The arguments of the LGB Alliance boil down to believing that gender identity does not exist, that there are only 2 sexes, and your gender cannot be different to your sex, meaning that they don't believe that trans people exist. And I hate the idea that there might be allies who are looking to learn more about the LGBT+ community and who stumble across the LGB Alliance page and think that that is the right way to be an ally and to support the community, because it really isn't. If a group of transphobes really want to be separate from the LGBT+ community and all the wonderful charities and figures who have made fantastic progress over the years for all LGBT+ people and who continue to do so, then that's their loss. But don't make out like you're some progressive, pro-cis LGB rights, pro-protecting women, pro-protecting children group when you're not, when you're just fundamentally anti-trans. And like that's it. It's beyond disappointing to me to see a group of people who are marginalised themselves spitting the same fear-mongering rubbish about trans people that was said about gay people only 10, 20 years ago. I can't get my head around why you would do that. If you don't agree with trans people, fine, but you don't have to set up a group that's entire focus is backtracking trans rights. Just leave trans people alone. And I wanted to make a video addressing this because I want to do my part in just highlighting how wrong they are, and that everybody within the LGBT+ community deserves to have their rights fought for and their identities respected. Think about giving this video a thumbs up and subscribing if you liked it, but no pressure. And as always guys, thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Much love. Bye!